Okay, I'm Duijzings, one of the co-conveners of this annual conference, and I'm going to introduce the first keynote speaker of this conference, John Judis. Last October, I read a long excerpt of his book that is called The Populist Explosion in The Guardian, which I thought was a very clear-headed, calm and dispassionate account, a historical account also, of a phenomenon that has been making a lot of people anxious. And so, as it happened, I was at the time indeed preparing the program for this annual conference, and I thought it would be a good idea to contact John and to ask him whether he would be willing to come to Germany, and that I did on the 8th of November, which was the US election day. And so I got an immediate response from John accepting the invitation. I think when I had done this one day later, he might have actually said no, because as he just told me, he's got hundreds of invitations to talk about his book in the meantime. So I think we should be very happy to have him here. Next morning, he wrote me an email. As I was checking the news, it was at sort of 5 or 6 in the morning, just being curious what had happened in the US. And John had written an email to me saying, it looks like the populist explosion might have detonated in the US tonight. So I think we were right on time inviting him, and we're very happy to have him here as a keynote speaker. He is an author, a journalist who is currently editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo TPM, which is a digital news organization in the United States covering a broad range of topics, politics, policy, national news in Washington, D.C. and beyond. It was originally a blog that has then developed into one of the most trusted websites in political journalism in the US. He is also a former senior writer at the National Journal, and until its takeover by another owner, he was a senior editor of the New Republic, another major weekly magazine specialized in politics and current affairs. He has an academic background. He studied philosophy at the University of California in Berkeley. And from the end of the 60s, he was very active in establishing and founding a number of journals, such as a journal called Socialist Revolution, which was later renamed in Socialist Review and Radical Society. And since then, he has written for numerous other publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Foreign Affairs, and the Washington Post. And apart from his most recent book, that is the reason why we have invited him here, he has written 6 other books, among which there are the books Genesis, Truman, American Jews and the Origin of the Arab-Israeli Conflict from 2014, The Folly of Empire, What George Bush Could Learn from Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, 2004, The Emerging Democratic Majority, 2002, The Paradox of American Democracy, Elites, Special Interests and Betrayal of Public Trust in 2000. Perhaps I would like to point out a few of the key ideas in the book, The Populist Explosion, before I give over the floor to John Judis. One of the, let's say, the most important probably ideas in the book is that populism is not an ideology, so it's not sort of located on the left or the right, but rather a political logic in which the people are pitted against an elite or the establishment. Populism resonates not only amongst, let's call them the losers of globalization, but also the middle classes who feel they are paying the redistributive tax burden of migration and of unemployment. It is a phenomenon, and that's very clear from the book, that exists both on the right and the left, especially in the US, most lately with Sanders and Trump, and also the European South, particularly in countries such as Greece and Spain. Whereas in the north of Europe, it is particularly a right-wing phenomenon, although not exclusively. Left-wing populism is dyadic, and right-wing populism is triadic. So I might assume he will explain this in his lecture. In his book, he limits himself to the established democracies. So in his insightful history, I would say, of the phenomenon, which he kind of starts in the US, he does not pay attention to Latin America, Eastern Europe, and other states with authoritarian legacies such as Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. So one of the reasons I think he is here is that he wants to learn about Eastern Europe. And I also guess to hear for himself how German or Bavarian Stammtisch discourse sounds. It's one of the, probably the only German word in the book that I've read. As you see, we will do our best to make this into a worthwhile experience for him as well. And I would like to invite you to take the floor and give your keynote.
I'm happy to be here. If you had asked me the next day, I would have said yes, too. I mean, after the end of the election, I wrote my publisher and I said, well, the bad news is that Trump won. The good news is that the book's going to sell for another few months. So that's... I hope I can keep going here. I just got in after one of these overnight flights 3 hours ago or so, and I was thinking that in America they have about 10 years ago, one of the hotel chains that caters to business travelers had an ad. I think it was Courtyard by Marriott, and they showed the weary business traveler giving a speech to an audience, and about halfway through dozing off, and the motto was, well, if you don't want this to happen to you, stay at our hotel. But I'll try to stay awake here. Am I not speaking? You can all hear me, right? It's just the problem over there. I was in, the only time I've ever spent more than a week or two in Germany was in the late spring and summer of 2002, when I was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. And if you remember that time, it was the build-up to the Iraq War in the United States. It was also Bush had pulled out of the climate talks. So I'm used to abuse from foreigners about our government. I feel this is a recurrent experience for me. First George W. Bush, now Donald Trump. Let me begin by talking a little about what populism is. And I'm mostly going to talk about the United States because I'm the crazy American here, and so I might as well do that. And I think, as Geir said, I'm not an expert or even very knowledgeable about Eastern and Southern Europe. So you could take my ideas comparatively in that sense. Political science is not a science. I hate to tell you this. It's not like physics. It's not the terms themselves can't be reduced to mathematical formulas. Even though you have all these studies. People say that genetically some people are conservatives and liberals. All this kind of crackpot stuff. When you look at a term, political terms like populism or liberalism, I learned my philosophy from Ludwig Wittgenstein. It was from Austria, a neighboring country here. there isn't an essence of populism, just as there isn't an essence of liberalism. If you go to Australia and talk about liberals there, they're completely different from liberals in the United States. Liberals in the United States are, quasi-social democrats in terms of Europe. In Latin America or in Australia, they're more, you'd say, libertarian, center-right, even conservative. So the same is true of populism. Sometimes in the United States, it's just a synonym for popular. When you get a Republican politician, let's say like the late Jack Kemp, who seems to care about somebody other than the business class, they're termed a populist. The guy cares about the poor, so he's a populist. Putin is sometimes described as a populist in the United States. I'm talking in my book and in what I want to talk to you today about a particular populist tradition that really begins in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. And that's where the word itself originates. A bunch of guys leaving a convention in Cincinnati in 1891 and trying to figure out a term to describe themselves. And that migrates to Western Europe in the 1970s and 1980s. The central characteristic of it is, again, a conflict based upon a division between the people and an elite or an establishment. It's different from, let's say, liberalism or what now the center-left politics in Europe, in the sense that liberals in America might worry more about the middle class and the working class than conservatives do, but they see themselves representing everyone and reaching a consensus. They're pluralistic in that sense. Conservatives, too, in the United States, if you ask a conservative, well, are you speaking only in behalf of your wealthy suburbanites? No, my policies apply to everyone. I think that what's good for business is good for everybody. So populism, no. Populism, there's a conflict between the people and the elite. And the demands themselves that populists make are ones that the existing establishment or elite are unwilling to grant. They're not things that can simply be subject to compromise. Let's take Bernie Sanders. Medicare for all. In other words, so you say socialized medicine was one of his demands. Now, that's not a crazy demand. In Europe you have this stuff all the time, right? It's Canada, single payer. But in the United States, Congress, it's just totally out of the question. We're in the process now of dismantling the kind of jerry-built health insurance program we have. So that demand in itself establishes a kind of demarcation, a conflict between the people and the elite. It defines that difference. If he had demanded, let's say, as Senator Warren now has, and would be nice, is that our Medicare policy should cover hearing aids. That's something you can negotiate. Medicare for all, no, you can't. Trump, build a wall that goes like the Great Wall of China. Again, not negotiable, something that the establishment is going to reject. So again, populism in this sense is built upon this conflict between the people and the elite that to all extents and purposes is not resolvable. Now, in America, unlike parts of, I would say, unlike parts of Europe, more again, Eastern Europe, the populism appears both on the left and the right. It's not it's not a specific ideology in that sense. It's more a logic, it's a relationship. Left-wing populism, again, think of Sanders, think of Podemos in Spain. Think of Mélenchon in France, who has become much more, who ran his campaign was much more, again, people rather than working class as the agent of change. In that case, it's a matter of uniting the middle and the bottom against the top. There's just two terms. This is why I guess I use this fancy term dyadic. You know, I don't generally use these terms, but you know, it's just two terms. Then you get a kind of right-wing populism where there also is the same kind of conflict between people and the elite. You know, it's easy to forget. When I first saw Donald Trump in August of 2015 in New Hampshire, I was shocked to hear him attack corporations for moving their jobs overseas and leaving American workers in the lurch. I was shocked to hear him complain about American corporations moving their headquarters to Ireland or where have you so they could avoid taxes. These are, again, this is the same kind of thing you would hear from Bernie Sanders as well. But in addition to that, there's another element that you find in this right-wing populism, which is that there's an other. There's another group, be they illegal immigrants, African Americans, Muslims, asylum seekers, that the populist claims that the elite is coddling, is favoring over the people. So there's this third term that always enters in. So, okay, so we have this left wing and we have this right wing. But now I want to confuse the distinction a little, which is to say that if you look at the right wing populists, and again, I would point to Trump in his campaign. We're going to talk about the presidency in a few minutes, but let's just talk about the campaign. Marine Le Pen, the Danes. You have many of the elements, again, that are in common with the left. Marine Le Pen's platform on banks, on social insurance, is to the left of the Democratic Party in the United States. I mean, she would make Hillary Clinton blush. She's too far, you know, she's an ultra-leftist. I mean, she wanted, part of their platform was that health insurance should apply regardless of income or region in the country. So, you know, people in small towns who had less income shouldn't get a less quality health insurance than people in Paris. It was demands you would characterize more of the left than the right. So it's hard to figure out what these kind of populist movements represent. And that's exactly what the essence of them is, if we're going to talk about an essence of this particular tradition, which is to say it defies the ordinary distinctions between center-left, center-right, liberal, conservative. And these movements arise. Now, in Europe, you have multi-party systems, so you can have these parties hanging around with 7% or 8%, and then all of a sudden burst forth. United States, we don't have that. We have just really a two-party system. So populism comes to us as an explosion or it just disappears. Now, when it emerges from its shell, when it functions as a kind of early warning signal that the prevailing politics of the establishment is no longer accepted by a significant minority of the population. Things are wrong. Something's happening. If you look in American history again, the populists of the 1890s, they were among the first people to start worrying about our chaotic banking system in the United States. We didn't have any kind of central banking system. And farmers used to get screwed every time there was a bad harvest. They'd all lose their farms. They were among the first people to worry also about the 8-hour day for working people. They were among the first to worry about, they wanted a graduated income tax. We didn't have that. We didn't have an income tax at all in the United States. They wanted senators directly elected rather than appointed by legislators. So there was a whole raft of demands they made. Now, you know, by 1896 or so, they were out of business, but within the next 20 or 30 years, culminating in the New Deal, a lot of these things come about. So, again, early warning signal. From the right, George Wallace, segregationist, 1960s. Segregation here, now, and forever. The idea that there's something wrong with a policy like busing black kids to white schools and vice versa in cities while neglecting the wealthy people in the suburbs. All this, a whole, again, set of demands. He becomes very popular. And again, not granted at the time, but then Ronald Reagan in 1980, and you get a kind of conservative political revolution in the United States in 1980 that incorporates some of what Wallace was talking about. Now, how can we understand what's going now in that same context of an early warning signal? Well, I need a drink before I get into this. This is fizzy water, right? Yeah. Let me make a historical distinction, and you know, all of you are sophisticated academics, so you'll know that I'm to some extent making some shortcuts here. And read my book. I do it more extensively, and in a way that doesn't slight the nuances. But in the United States, and also in Western Europe after World War II, you have a prevailing economic philosophy that's shared by Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Democrats in the United States, Republicans. And it's an idea that you could say was demand-driven. And the idea is that if you raise people's wages, if the working class does well, then that will redound to the profits of the nation's companies. Those companies and the working class will be paying more in taxes. The state will have more revenue. There can be more benefits. The benefits themselves would be used to increase consumer demand. And you'd have a kind of virtuous Keynesian circle, beginning with, again, the welfare of the people, of the working class, that triggers prosperity. And, and you have something like that for the 30 glorious years, as the French like to talk about it, from 1945 to, let's say, the early 1970s. 1970s, beginning of economic problems. United States, it's the first time we realized that, we've helped rebuild all these economies, and now they're out-competing us. So there's competition horizontally. Also, growth of the labor movement. 1960s, you get a lot of new entrants into the labor movement, public workers, farm workers. So the corporations feel pressure both horizontally and vertically from below. And you get in the United States, at least, and I think that obviously this also happens in Europe with Thatcher and Mitterrand, you get a new kind of philosophy emerging. And if you call the one demand side, you can call the second supply side. Sometimes in Europe they call about neoliberal. I call it sometimes market liberalism in the United States. And that is the idea that if you do things that will raise the profits of corporations, those profits themselves will fund higher wages, greater taxes, more social benefits, and everybody will be happy. Ronald Reagan used to talk about a rising tide will lift all boats, and he said that in the context of proposing a huge tax cut for the wealthy, with the idea that they would invest the money, people would get jobs, wages, taxes. In other words, it was the exact reverse, with the same promise of prosperity at the end. Supply side rather than demand side driven. Now, what were some of the features of this new neoliberal or liberal market philosophy? First was the idea of capital mobility, that corporations should be able to move wherever in the world they want in search of higher profit rates. In addition to that, the idea, again, that capital itself should be allowed to move, liquid capital. There shouldn't be capital controls. And most of what passes as trade treaties from, the 1980s on have very little to do with free trade and much more to do with capital mobility in this sense. Second idea, labor mobility. That immigrants, workers should be allowed to come to wherever country they can make the most money. Now, in the United States, this appears partly in a very humanitarian form in 1965, because, we wouldn't let, we tried to discourage anybody who wasn't an Anglo-Saxon from coming into our country after 1924. But it has the effect of vastly increasing the number of immigrants coming into our country, particularly unskilled immigrants from the south, from south of the border. And in 1991, there's further legislation, and at that point, business is very much on board, because one of the effects of this huge influx of immigration is to put pressure downward on wages, to discourage unionization, all kinds of things that, again, supply side, favor profitability. So those are the two of the ideas. In addition to that, as again, this is very characteristic of the United States and Reagan, but Reagan and Bill Clinton, deregulation of finance, get rid of regulations, tax cuts that are targeted at speculators, at corporations. So the whole burden of taxes changes remarkably. In the United States, Eisenhower era, the highest marginal tax rates were 90%. By the Reagan era, it's like 28%. Now it's back up to, 35, 36%. But, a dramatic change again. So you have this supply-side neoliberal philosophy prevailing in the United States. And, again, as a footnote, the same thing happens in Great Britain with Thatcher. The same thing happens with Mitterrand in France when his socialist experiment fails in 1981 because of a huge trade deficit. And you know this story probably better than I do. And he makes a U-turn and adopts a politics of austerity. As long as this kind of supply-side philosophy seems to work and produce prosperity, and I'm thinking about, the 1980s after our big recession in the United States, the internet boom in the 1990s. In Europe, you get all these countries like Spain and Greece having this enormous influx of money as a result of the euro initially that boosts their economy. As long as that kind of thing happens, you don't get a populist upsurge. But when there starts to be problems, then suddenly what you get is a questioning of this consensus among the establishment. United States, we have a peculiar recession in 1991 that isn't deep, but seems to last for 5 years. Lasts until the spring of 1996. People called it a jobless recovery. 1992, Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan. Ross Perot, important figure in American history. A billionaire like Trump, much more of a left-wing than a right-wing populist. At one point in May of 1992, he was actually ahead in the polls of both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And he might have, he could conceivably have won that year, but he was kind of quirky and had never dealt with the kind of pressures of a presidential run. He wasn't like Trump, a television personality. And when he started to get questioned heavily, he really couldn't take it, and he dropped out of the race. And then he comes back in September, and he still gets about 20% of the vote, which is a large amount. So, again, a populist campaign focused on the North American Free Trade Committee. free trade agreement, focused on the business lobbyists in Washington who are screwing people and don't care about the ordinary person. 1996, Perot and Buchanan run again. But all of a sudden in the spring, you start to see the first blossoms of the internet revolution, the high-tech boom coming, and they're gone. They don't go anywhere in that election. And that's, again, an era of tremendous optimism in the United States about the economy. Bill Clinton goes along with financial deregulation. So it's a time when it seems like this whole promise of supply-side neoliberalism is going to come to fruition. After that, you get 9/11, and the Americans are focused on the war on terror and the threat of people coming into the country and blowing us up. So politics really focuses a lot on that. Then comes the Great Recession. The Great Recession, again, is really the first very, very much more clear than the 1991 recession, signaled that something is wrong here. And you get the Tea Party, you get Occupy Wall Street, and then you get Trump and Sanders, neither of which were taken seriously at the beginning of the election. Because we have these long elections that go a year and a half. So I'm talking about in the summer of 2015. Neither of them were taken seriously as political candidates, but all of a sudden you find this tremendous upsurge. And both of them, again, ran campaigns that were you couldn't characterize as either standard Republicanism or standard Democratic fare. Sanders attacked the billionaire class. Heavy emphasis on redistribution, free college education. Again, Medicare for all, things that are familiar to the Danes, perhaps, but not to Americans. But they got a tremendous amount of support. Trump, too. Again, in addition to the attacks against the legal immigrants, you get a lot of stuff about corporations and corporations moving to Mexico, bad trade deals that screw American workers, and so on. So, you get, again, these populist candidates. Now, where does their support come from? And here there's a kind of interesting resemblance to Europe, and Western Europe in particular. If you look at Trump's support, George Wallace, I mentioned him before, 1968, candidate who was also a populist. He was for higher taxes on the rich, as well as against the idea that the elites were favoring African Americans. So, again, this two-dimension. His support tended to be older, white, male, blue collar. At the time, people who had only graduated from high school, but this is, again, we're talking about 1968 and 1972. By 2000 or by 2016, those are the same people who have graduated from high school and have gone to trade schools or have gone to junior colleges, but may not have four-year college degrees. So there's a similarity between this Wallace constituency and Trump. And it's as if this group of people goes through the electorate so if you think of when a python swallows a large animal like a beaver, and you can see it going through its body, from the late 1960s, early 1970s to the present. And these are the same people, again, that identified in Great Britain as the Left Behinds. If you look at Trump's vote, if you look at a chart in the United States of where we've lost the most manufacturing jobs between 2005 and 2015. There is a chart like this on the internet. And if you compare those states to the swing states that Trump won and wasn't supposed to win, oh my God, it's the same exact places. For instance, you know, people, when I ask people in America, they always say, oh, well, yeah, it must be Ohio and Michigan. And yes, those two states had a lot of loss of manufacturing jobs. But you don't realize a state, and I hope I'm not getting too much into the weeds here for you, like North Carolina in the South. You know, Hillary Clinton was going to win that because there's a lot of high tech now in the Raleigh-Durham area. Big minority vote in North Carolina. But it's a state that lost the greatest percentage of manufacturing jobs in that period, mainly furniture, but also textiles. A lot of them went to Mexico. So again, heart of Trump's constituency, kind of left behind. Similar again to northern France, Marine Le Pen, where she's, you know, her Pas de Calais, that whole area of northern France, working class suburbs. Some of them ex-communists, just like if you're talking about Trump, a lot of areas that used to be very, very loyally Democratic. Now, Sanders is a harder one to figure out, and I have to think about this a little. Mainly college-educated and young. The heart of his constituency are, let's say, 18 to 34-year-olds, and most of whom were either going to or had graduated from college. Now, you know, the standard fare on these people is, well, they're idealistic. They're young and idealistic, and you know, the political scientists sometimes use this term that they're post-materialistic. But there's a whole other dimension to what's happening to these kids. You know, on the surface, the most obvious thing is student debt in the United States, which is just ballooned. I mean, kids have to, my kids, you know, are, what? I mean, when they left school, they were $40,000 in debt. And you know what that means if you're about to get a job and stuff like that. And one of my older daughter has to work in nonprofits because that's the only way her debt, if she works in nonprofits for 10 years, her student loans will get forgiven. So there's this tremendous accumulation of debt that students now face in going to college. But in addition to that, the American economy is changing in ways that are often not observed. And I want to just read you a quote here. I just have two things that I'm going to read you. This is from two Democratic economists, one of whom, Alan Kruger, was head of the Council of Economic Advisors. So I'm not, you know, fixing this with some odd people. And they conclude from this study of 2005 to 2015. A striking implication of these estimates is that all of the net employment growth in the U.S. economy from 2005 to 2015 appears to have occurred in alternative work arrangements. Now, what are those? Part-time, temporary, and contract jobs. Contract jobs in the United States, somebody pays you as an independent contractor and you don't get health benefits or anything like that. It's like Uber drivers, you know, are very characteristic of this. These are jobs that don't have the kind of lifetime security that we thought of in the 1960s. Kids who graduate now from college, I've seen the figures, you know, but in the first 10 years have maybe an average of 3 different jobs during that period. It used to be like, you know, there used to be one and a half. So there's a tremendous amount of insecurity brewing in the economy. And I think that that's central to understanding the kind of support that somebody like Bernie Sanders gets, and why you suddenly see this amazing kind of statistics where, you know, 51 to 42% kids think that there's something wrong with capitalism. Now, this is not, you know, or favors socialism. This was like, socialism was a dirty word. Even when I was in the New Left, we used to have problems with this. So something's going on in the economy, and again, in Europe, it's more overt. in places like Spain, Italy, Greece, where the unemployment rate among the young is, 40% and above. And there, I went to a Podemos conference in Madrid, and you could take a Bernie Sanders meeting and a Podemos conference, and the people were just interchangeable. The only difference was probably, yes, more of the young people didn't have jobs. But other than that, going to college, it's the same people. Now even in France, who got the most votes among the 18 to 24-year-olds in the last election? Mélenchon, 31%. Again, something's happening to both these kind of constituencies, both the left behinds and the college educated who are suddenly not finding a kind of secure future that they did. And again, this is something that is peculiar in part to the United States, but I think has some application too to understanding what's going on in Western Europe. Now let's talk a little about Trump. One of the things I said about populism is that it's an early warning signal. It's a sign that there's problems ahead. And, what ordinarily happens is that, you wait 20 or 30 years and then, you do build, to be silly about it, you do build this great wall that cuts off Mexico. But it doesn't happen the next year or anything. Because the demands themselves are ones that the political establishment won't grant. Now, I'm talking about the United States and Western Europe. Latin America, you could have Chavez coming to power from a military background, so he has the military behind him, and you can do a lot of things as a populist then that you couldn't do in the United States with the checks and balances. United States, Trump wins. I hate to say this, but it really was a fluke. It was a matter of, in the United States, third-term candidates from the same party have a lot of trouble winning elections. Al Gore in 2000, because they inherit all the grievances from the previous 8 years. In addition, Hillary Clinton just runs an execrable campaign. I hope that word doesn't... terrible, awful campaign that's primarily centered on how bad a guy Trump is and misses this whole economic dimension of what's happening in the country and the kind of anxiety that people feel. So she loses, and you know the whole figure. She actually wins the popular vote, but it's a kind of fluky election. So this guy becomes president. Now, again, checks and balances. In the United States, in Congress, he gets a Republican Congress, but during the early part of the primaries, when he was running against all these people, out of, I think it was like 233 members of the House of Representatives, he had exactly 9 people endorse him. In the Senate, what was there? It was like, 54 Republicans, 1 endorsement, Jeff Sessions, and now our Attorney General. He had no endorsement from any former head of a cabinet. No secretaries of state, no secretaries of treasury, housing, anything, nothing. I mean, one of the highest people he had was this guy Flynn, who has already had to resign and who had been forced to resign by Obama. So, again, if you're thinking about the establishment, he had no support, virtually no support. And that, again, affects who he can draw upon for his cabinet. As you might know, I mean, there are like 400 positions unfilled in the Trump administration now. I mean, there's whole wastelands within cabinet departments where there's nobody working there because, who is he going to find that agrees with him and is loyal to him? And they appoint these people, and then they find that they made a tweet, in June disparaging Trump, and then they're fired. So, that's been the pattern. Again, in Congress, very little support. And within the electorate itself, if you look at the election in 2016, and I've analyzed the polling results to the extent that you can trust anything these days, I would estimate that Trump's active support, the people who believed in all his program, was about 25% at most of the electorate. Maybe 30%, but that's the absolute top. And we're talking about the people who actually voted. The rest of the people who voted for him that gave him the presidency were Republicans who were going to vote for a Republican regardless, people who couldn't stand Hillary Clinton more than they couldn't stand Trump, and people who had single issues like abortion or guns on the basis of which they voted for Trump, even if they didn't agree with anything else. So he doesn't have this kind of massive support in the country, and you can see it in the initial polling about who approves of him and who disapproves of him. Again, it comes about strongly approve is about 25% to 30%. So he has this very, very unusual position for an American president. I mean, nobody in my lifetime, and I can't remember anyone in history who's come into the presidency with this kind of lack of a base either within the establishment or the electorate. So what happens? Now, rhetorically, I think Trump has really tried to stick to his guns, and I think that's you could see it to a great extent in the influence of Stephen Bannon from Breitbart.com, who is kind of the ideological father of this campaign. I'll just read you what Trump says in his inaugural address because you'll hear the echoes of a very clear populist appeal. He says, "For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country." You know, very straight populist appeal. And he makes a similar appeal when he talks to the Conservative Political Action Conference in a few months. And you can hear it again today. I mean, if you listen to a lot of the way Trump talks. But in terms of his actual program, he's been stymied. Trade, again, a lot of talk. He's been complaining lately about the Germans. He's not going to be able to do anything about that. We all understand that. I mean, even if he wanted to, Congress wouldn't go along. Mexico and NAFTA, he talks about renegotiating that. Nothing's happened. Immigration. Deport 11 million illegal immigrants, not going to happen. Wall, not going to happen. What else? A key thing is the health care, too, because, again, Trump had this peculiar position of the populist of being both left-wing and right-wing. And one of the things he said in his campaign was he was going to protect Social Security and Medicare, and while he was going to replace Obamacare, our health insurance thing, he was going to replace it with something that was more universal, that covered everyone, and cheaper. And he repeated that several times. And for all I know, he believed it, because at one point, Trump himself had been in favor of a single-payer system. But what's come down, what he has ended up agreeing to in the House of Representatives is what we used to call a throw the widows out in the snow kind of bill that just, screws 24 million people are going to lose their insurance. It's just a travesty. It takes us back to where we were before we had the very imperfect Obamacare bill. So, in many ways, what's happened on a policy level is that where he's gotten some traction and gotten somewhere it's been only where he's coincided with what a right-wing Republican like Ted Cruz, one of his opponents, would have wanted to do, like the health care bill. To the extent that he's done stuff on immigration, that's again stuff that right-wing Republicans would have agreed to. The stuff on the environment and the tax breaks for business, those are again very typical kinds of Republican stands. So populism remains in the rhetoric, but in terms of governance, very much like a conservative Republican would have governed. Now, the problem is that his populism and his eccentricities and his tweets and all that stuff continues to offend people in his own party and the Washington Republican establishment, while the very conservative thrust of his policy is mobilizing Democrats. So, again, we're in a situation in the United States where we have these kind of freaky elections that Democrats haven't won in 50 years in districts, and suddenly they almost win 50 to 48. So he really is creating a kind of upsurge against him. And again, I think his fate in the end will probably rest, if not on some crazy scandal erupting. You know, you don't know what's going to happen with this Russia stuff. On the economy, I mean, if the economy really keeps going, which I think we're at the end of a cycle, not at the beginning, he might be able to muddle through and get reelected. Again, the Democrats are not exactly all together as a party, but it looks to me like he's heading for disaster. Now, let me conclude just by saying a few things about, again, Trump as an early warning and why, in fact, even in the face of the disaster of his administration, there are things that he talked about. And again, I think this applies also to the right-wing populists in Western Europe and their critique of the European Union and the Euro that are still worth thinking about. First, "Make America Great Again," Trump's slogan. Now, the Democrats' reply to that was, well, America is great. You know, we now have 5% unemployment where we had 10% unemployment. But to a lot of older voters, including myself, we hear something much different when we hear those words. When I was a kid in the 1950s and I went into a store, I would look around and I'd only buy something that said "Made in the USA." And that was not because I was a patriot. It had nothing to do with the flag. It was because we made the best things. You know, the Germans made a few things, but this was the wake of World War II, because so nobody would buy anything German. Japanese, they were all knockoffs, you know, that was just copying our stuff. By the 1980s, all that's changed. You want a television, it's going to be Japanese. Machine tools, German, Swiss. Again, you can't appreciate the kind of impact that this had. And it was very important to Ross Perot in 1992, "Made in the USA," part of his slogan. And it's very important to understanding Trump and to understanding what Trump talks about when he talks about reviving manufacturing. That resonates. Now, what he actually wants to do, bring back coal mining, focus on steel plants, is ridiculous. It makes no sense. But on the other hand, there's a kernel of real truth there. The United States is not doing enough in advanced manufacturing. I always wonder, I have my hearing aids, you know, and they are made in Denmark. Now, I looked, and the United States is nowhere in this. Machine tools, we're 10th. Batteries, solar technology, all these kind of things. There's a real issue there. The emphasis on finance over manufacturing. There's a real problem there. So in that sense, again, I think that that both Trump and to the same extent Sanders were onto something, but it's not something that's necessarily there. You know, it's not something that's going to get worked out by them. In fact, you know, in reaction to Trump, we might go back to the same kind of market liberalism. You find that in France with Macron, I'm afraid, unless the Germans are willing to cooperate with him. I mean, I think it's going to be another disaster like Hollande, where he's not going to be able to revive the economy. And 2020, we could get a Democratic president like that. But again, these issues are going to fester. You know, the idea that there's some imbalance in the world economy. Trump says it in all these screwy ways. He blames he goes on about the Chinese and the Germans, but there is a problem there, right? In Europe, there's a problem. Germany's trade surplus, Japan, what it means for Spain, Italy, Greece, these debts. I mean, again, he talks in this ridiculous way, you know, bad, evil Germans, but there's something there. Same with China, imbalance in the world economy. So again, he's getting at real issues, just in the most in the most unproductive manner you can imagine. And even, let's say, when he comes to Europe and talks about NATO. Now, you know, everybody knows this dirty little secret that NATO was created in the framework of the Cold War to resist the Soviet Union, and since 1989, it's been looking for an identity. Now, he again puts it in the most divisive way, but there's an issue there. So I guess what I'm saying again is that Trump, populism, early warning, should take it seriously, shouldn't just dismiss it. Even, let's say, immigration. You know, no question that he's a nativist and a xenophobe and talking about Mexicans bringing rapists and criminals into the country. I mean, we have enough rapists and criminals in our country without immigrants coming into the country. But in terms of low-wage workers flooding the market and making it very difficult for other workers who only have a high school education, absolutely true. There's something going on there, and we have to think about what to do about it. So again, my message is, yes, things are bad in the United States, and things are going in a bad direction. And, people are going nuts over this Russia stuff, and it's like Clinton with Benghazi. But there's a kernel of truth in what's happening with these populists in both Western Europe and the United States that we would be very stupid to dismiss and to say that, everything's bad with these people. They're not raising any legitimate issues. So that's my pitch for you. How'd I do?